We have a few more talks for you today, and our next speaker is a co-author of the best-selling books, 50 Quick Ideas to Improve Your User Stories and 50 Quick Ideas to Improve Your Tests. And he's also a contributor to the book More Agile Testing. He's an experienced Agile consultant, coach, and a trainer with 30 years of IT experience. Please welcome to the stage, David Evans.
Thank you. Thank you, Jana, and thank you very much. Gosh, it's like I've just been backstage. I don't think I've ever been backstage before. That's quite amazing. I feel like I'm getting the proper rock star treatment with all the lights and the comfy seats and so forth. So I'm David. I'm from Australia, so I wanted to say a special thanks for turning the weather up this week. It makes me feel very at home. But you really didn't need to go to that length to welcome me. But it's much appreciated. So I'm going to do a very, very small amount of advertising. I don't like to talk much about myself and my company, but I think given where I am today, it's appropriate. So I work for a small consultancy called Neuri, and that's just me and 3 other guys, one of which is arguably one of Belgrade's more famous sons, Gojko Edzic. How about a little cheer? Come on. Yeah. He'll appreciate that. So as was mentioned, we've put a few books together. So the topic of this talk is mostly covered by Gojko's book Specification by Example. Obviously, he's written some other books as well, and we've co-authored some books in the 50 Quick Ideas series as well. Okay, but enough about me. I wanted to firstly thank you for turning up to this talk. I know you have other good choices, so thank you for choosing this one. But in respect of that, I thought I'd give you a quick précis of what this talk is about and how it's structured. So the catchy title was setting a good example, but the important bit was getting the most out of your SBE, BDD, and ATDD artifacts. I'm just going to break down what I mean by each of those phrases. So when I say getting the most out of, I'm really talking mostly about extending the useful life of things. So we get more value out of things by being able to make them useful to us for longer. So that's primarily what I'm trying to do is, rather than thinking we're creating throwaway or one-off artifacts, I want you to be able to create things that have a longer life. What did I mean by this alphabet soup? Well, I'm hoping these terms are familiar to you. SBE stands for Specification by Example, and that's the phrase that we use as an umbrella term for BDD, for behavior-driven development, or the slightly older term of acceptance test-driven development. So there are people who would argue that each of these has some subtle difference. For the purposes of this talk, though, I'm treating each of these things synonymously. So all of the advice that I'm giving applies if you say, well, we do BDD, but we don't do SBE, or vice versa. There's enough overlap between each of these things that everything I talk about today should apply, whichever flavor you claim to subscribe to. And the last word was this artifacts. Now, some people think, well, it's an odd term to use. You are talking about tests, aren't you? I said, well, there's good reasons why I avoid the term tests. But yes, if you're using Cucumber or SpecFlow as your context, we're talking about your feature files. If you use Fitness or similar table-based frameworks, we're talking about your pages of examples. It's really anything that constitutes executable specifications. Those are the artifacts that I'm talking about. You could also apply some of this advice to the non-executable stages of your artifacts. So if you're creating useful documentation via example, by putting concrete examples into something like a wiki or even a Word document, that's still an artifact that is useful as a specification with examples. So I'd include that within the scope as well. One final thing to say about the word artifact, it comes from the Latin arte factum. It means made with skill. So when archaeologists and so forth are digging up artifacts out of the ground, the reason they find those interesting is not because they're old, it's because they're things that were made with skill. They're evidence of a skilled civilization that created them. And that's why I choose that word for the things I'm talking about, because I want people to apply skill when they're creating these artifacts. One final thing you might think, is that spelled correctly? It's only the Americans that use the I spelling for artifact, where I stands for incorrect. Apologies to Jeff and other Americans who might be in the audience. And the structure of this, well, I'm going to identify some of the common mistakes that I've seen teams make when they set out on a journey of using Spec by Example or BDD. So I'll give you some direct tips on how you might improve the style of the things you're creating. I'll do so by digging out some real examples. So you need to be prepared to, I know it's after lunch and you want a lightweight talk probably. I am going to get into some fairly grungy stuff. And I'll give you sort of 5 key takeaways if you're just sort of waiting for the thing to write in your notepad. Well, you're probably not writing anything in a notepad. Nobody does that these days, do they? They all take photos of screens. I see a few. Good. Good on you for still being analog. For those who do prefer to take photos, I'm using Prezi, not PowerPoint. So lots of my things sort of shift around a bit and build. Therefore, when there's an optimal time to take the photo, look out for the little camera icon in the corner. And that might be a good opportunity to get the screenshot photo, should you wish to. Okay, so it's not a basic talk, it's not an introductory talk, but I'll give you this one sort of introduction to the concept of Spec by Example, because I think it's a simple enough idea. The difficulty is in the doing, in the implementation. But conceptually, Spec by Example is simply this relationship. It's simply saying that if we take examples that we naturally use as human beings to help clarify what we mean with our software requirements, that's a normal and natural human thing for us to do. If we take enough care and enough consideration and express with the right level of detail those examples, the same examples can become the tests that verify that I've satisfied those requirements. That's the basic premise that's going on here. So we know naturally that good examples help us understand the general rule. As I say, that's a natural way for us to communicate as human beings. So we just need to remember that when we talk about requirements, we're really talking about a business rule. And when we talk about tests, we're talking about instances that we can check. So tests are essentially examples that test points on the general rule. So that, I think, is the one-page reminder of what's going on when we're doing specification by example. Okay. Now, I've got a couple of kids. They're pretty much grown up now, but for a while they were growing up, it seems that we lived on a steady diet of Pixar films, and my wife will attest to this. It feels like we're only now catching up with sort of all the real grown-up films because we've had a steady diet of Pixar films while our kids were young. One of their favorites was the film Up. I know it's a young audience here, but who remembers Up? Have you seen the film Up? Oh, good. I'm reassured that some of you have seen it. For the benefit of those who don't, it tells the story of a character, Carl, in his old age, but the opening sequence of the film features 6-year-old Carl and the girl who became his wife, Ellie. And they are planning the exotic adventures they're going to have. And so Ellie invites Carl to her little cubby hideaway, and she's explaining this place that she wants to go. It's called South America. And she explains what South America is to 6-year-old Carl in these hushed tones, and it goes like this. She says, "We're going to South America. It's like America, but south." Now, interestingly, when people are introduced to the idea of acceptance test-driven development, they're already familiar with TDD, and it's like, well, it's just TDD, but A. And that's about all the introduction that people have. And I think that's a bit of a sad thing, because I'm not dissing TDD. It's a good thing, and everyone who practices it is doing the right thing. But it's a drastic oversimplification of things to say, well, they're just, everything is like TDD, except these are acceptance tests instead of not acceptance tests. So I think just coupling SBE, BDD, and ATDD with TDD is the wrong way to look at it as a topic. Because what it leads to is this idea, this false idea, I have to say, so don't photograph this one, that our ATDD artifacts are just tests. If we do that, we'll end up making all of the mistakes that this talk is about trying to help you undo. So, but it's a common mistaken starting point to make, but it's important to realize that this is not it. Especially because that kind of mentality leads to some pretty awful examples, and this is just one that I've came across in my travels. If you've ever sort of had to get insurance online, you know that there's a bunch of questions you have to answer. This rather bizarre example, and you don't need to read the detail of it. Please don't hurt your head. This example came from a context of a business that offered business insurance. Now you can imagine that's a complex thing. So the online form you have to fill out to take out insurance for your company, for your business, is going to be a complicated set of questions. It was I think 7 pages of questions where the questions that appear on page 2 differ according to the answers you gave on page 1 and so forth. So it was a complex web of things that were put together. And I was brought into this company and they just started with BDD and they showed me this as an example to see whether I could offer a coach's opinion on this. And of course my opinion was, what the failing test is this rubbish? And they were somewhat offended that I should, criticize their work. They were saying, well, come on, it's got all the BDDs in it. It's got givens and whens and thens. It's not referring to technical terms. And more to the point, it wasn't written by the technical team. It was written by the product owner. Now, so it was kind of like, take that, Mr. Consultant. I happen to know that the product owner of this team was, a very intelligent and very good product owner. She knew the topic very well. She seemed to have all the qualities that I would, want a team to have in a good PO. And so I was rather surprised that this was something that she would have created. It just didn't really add up. So I went and spoke to her, and I, showed this example and said, "Can you give me a bit of a story behind this?" And she said, well, yeah, this is pretty much what the story is. It's fairly straightforward. For legal reasons, we have to change the text of some of the questions that we ask in our online form. And there were 6 questions. These IDs were things that were meaningful to her because those were the language-independent unique IDs of these particular questions, each of which then has a text version in English and other languages. And each of those had to change. And I said, okay, that doesn't sound, terribly complex. So here's my first tip. If you really are just, you have a story that's about changing text strings, then you don't need to use BDD, you don't need to use SBE, you should use JFDI. So that's an aside, but let's assume this was an important enough thing to actually go through the examples of. I said to her, well, do you presumably have some kind of master list of what the text values are for each of your questions? You've got that in some kind of, either it's certainly in your database, but you have it in some accessible form. She said, well, yeah, this is, here's an extract of it. Here's those 6 IDs. Here's what the text should say, and here's what the text sort of says at the moment that needs to change. I said, okay, perfect. This is this is what you need to do. You just need to provide these examples to your development team. They can essentially automate the testing of the implementation from this. And she kind of looked at me as if I was a bit stupid and said, well, of course, that's the first thing I gave them. But they said to me, we're doing this thing called BDD now, and they wouldn't write a single line of code until I'd given them an acceptance test where every sentence started with the word given, when, or then. And so that rather nasty-looking, big, long verbiage was the result. Because in her context, how did she acceptance test something like this? Well, she didn't have a means of going straight into the database and checking these things automatically. So the way that she would test that the right question text was coming up in the right places meant that she would have to go through the form. And that's why that big, long BDD scenario was talking about, well, I'd need to answer this on this question, and she knew the right keys to unlock the right questions on page 4, where one of these new text values would appear. So she knew which answers she had to give in all the other places in order for that to appear. And that's really what her BDD scenario was describing, was the sequence of actions she'd need to take. So that's that was the first problem, is that she was focusing on how she would test it. And she didn't realize that the thing that was really important was what to test. So that was the first thing she actually had, was this set of, okay, here are the question IDs, here's the new text we need. That's what needs to change. And instead she was asked to focus on doing the test, where in her context that was, okay, well, this is how I would test that. If I had no other option, I would do everything through the UI. So, but the team gave no help on that. They didn't sort of say that, yes, we could take your the original list you gave us and just write an automated query against the database to say, okay, for this ID, here's the current text value, that doesn't match what you want, and that test will now pass when it does match. That clearly would have been the simple way to do it. So this is one of the first mistakes that people make, is they focus their specification or their test descriptions on how you test, when instead you should always be focusing on what you test, not how you test it, because that's up to the development team to find the most appropriate way to do the mechanics of testing that this is correct. So your product owner, your other specification authors should always focus on what it is we need to do, not how to do it. Okay, so as I say, this leads us back to this first false assumption that what we're talking about is just a test. It's more than that, because our artifacts really need to serve 3 purposes. And there's sort of 3 separate purposes at important points in time. There's the now, the soon, and the later. So now is like we're first discussing and understanding this story or this feature or this change we're going to make. So the first role for my artifact is I'm specifying the thing we need. I'm specifying the behavior that should happen that's different to the behavior that I have at the moment. So the first role for this artifact is as a specification. The soon role, that is, assuming we implement this now, this sprint, in a couple of days, I want to have an automated test that takes the same artifact, the same data in it, the same examples, and says, I've checked each of these examples explicitly, and they do hold true. So the role then is of an acceptance test. But there's a third and somewhat overlooked role. That's the later stage, which is to say, well, when we come back, maybe in a couple of months' time, we're trying to understand what our system does and what its behavior is, I'd like to be able to go to these examples as documentation of our system behavior. So this arguably is the hardest bit to get right, because we have a tendency to optimize for the thing we need now. So we might optimize for a specification, or more commonly, optimize for a test, not thinking about its possible or potential value to us as documentation after the fact. But in doing so, that's how we extend the natural life. We can, if we get paid back for this effort in documentation that we don't need to write because our specs serve as that documentation, then we've already paid down a deposit on things we might need in the future. Okay, so that's your second important point, number 2. And a consequence of this is that when we are assembling our content, the details associated with a story, we really need to think that logically there's 2 separate things going on. The story itself is about getting a team to agree that there's a change we need to make. But the effect of that change is what's held in the specification. So the story can be thought of as a short-lived artifact, and the specification is a long-lived artifact, which is to say, the same analogies, the story is about making the change, so I need to understand what is the urgency of this, can we do this, how long will it take us, all that sort of metadata is to do with the story about the change itself, but the impact or the effect of that change is described in the specification, and that carries long-lived value. I don't particularly need to understand the history of our sequence of changes, the story by story and sprint by sprint, but I do want to know what is the cumulative effect of all these changes in terms of my system's behavior as it stands today. So, therefore, each element of our story carries these things. So we talk about acceptance criteria on stories. That's our checklist of how do we know we're done on that story. Once those are ticked off, that's fine. I don't particularly need to go back to those, but in many cases, the mechanism by which I verify those criteria are automated acceptance tests. And those are long-lived artifacts because those become part of my regression suite. Any test worth writing, I often say, is worth running all the time. So for each acceptance test you add, that should by default be going into your regression suite. And similarly, the media on which we record these items needs to be thought carefully as well. It's fine to put your stories on a temporary medium like a sticky or a card on a physical board or a ticket in Jira or whatever, but you don't want your specifications living in the same medium. I really do not want to have to sift through Jira to find, sprint number 9, story number 120, that's where we sort of change the behavior of the pricing logic. So I need to go and find that to understand how we price our goods now. No, your pricing logic is business logic. It's core to your domain. That needs to go in an appropriate medium suitable for documentation. So that's more like a wiki or something like that. So here's your third most important point, that think of the story as the envelope that carries an important message. And the specification is the message that sits inside that story envelope. And so even if when you're first putting your story information together, you're perhaps mangling the two, at some point you need to realize I need to be able to logically separate these. I need to be able to throw away the envelope but keep the message that's inside. Okay, so I said I'd take a little bit of a deep dive, so we're going to start that now. I want to introduce the idea of the qualities that I look for in a good specification with examples. And it's not accidental that these terms sort of sound, come from the world of visuals. Focus, balance, and contrast sound like controls you used to have on a TV set. These are important because essentially the artifacts we create are visual things. They are things that we want to perceive as a human being. So the first quality I want to look at is the idea of balance. So here's one example. And as I say, all of these are real things. They're not made up. But we start easy because you should be able to see pretty quickly what's wrong with an example like this. So it's called payroll, and the scenario is simple acceptance test for payroll. That's a really bad scenario name for the first thing. So bad, scores 0 points from me for the scenario description. You should always take that opportunity to describe what your business rule is. We then go to say, well, given the following employees, and we've got Jeff Smith and Tom Jones, their addresses and their salaries, when we run the payroll, then all checks are printed correctly. Well, okay, somebody has had to go and implement that step. Well, what exactly are they doing? So a developer who implements the automation of this is making some arbitrary decisions about what we mean by all checks being printed correctly. Furthermore, this data that we inject in the givens, well, how do we can assume that's somehow related to our idea of the correctness of the checks, but how would we know this? In other words, if I change one of those values, what do I expect to happen differently? is this test going to fail or not? So it's a rather bizarre mismatch of the level of detail between the givens and the thens. So the rule here is that, yes, we want to watch out for any givens that are irrelevant to the thens. So we don't want to have a difference in our abstraction between input and output. It's fine to choose the appropriate level of abstraction, but you've got to be consistent between your inputs and your outputs. And another thing that I say that might be useful to remember is, this is, I guess, another aspect of balance, is that we want to have hourglass-shaped scenarios. It's okay to have multiple phrases in your givens and multiple phrases in your thens, because essentially you're saying, these are all the preconditions that I need, and in the thens, these are all the postconditions I'm checking. But the when should always be a single statement. The when is about the event that you are testing. So try to keep a single statement for your when. Don't do when this and this and this. Then you haven't really thought about what is the actual action under test. Okay, so that's the balance. The next one is about focus. So, gosh, here's another difficult one. I'm going to help you through this because this is not easy on the eyes or on the brain. So it's called statement and the scenario weekly statement. So it's something to do with bank accounts and it's something to do with showing transactions in a statement. It's somewhat bizarre. There's a lot of repeated stuff in here. There's a lot of strange abbreviations. It's not clear what's going on. It's very difficult to see what is the actual rule or what's the thing we're specifying here. But let's try to take this apart. Okay, so we've got some accounts, and one of those accounts has an ID of 1. I highlight that because that's the only thing that seems to vary in this. Everything else, this XD direct, XD 10 million or however much that is, 0 and 0, those don't vary for each of these. So that's a pretty good clue that none of that information is relevant to this test. But we've got 3 accounts, 1, 2, and 3. And we've got a user ID, 187, that happens to have an association with an account 1. So maybe that account we created, number 1, now belongs to user 187. So that looks like that might be important. We don't know whether the other stuff like the name and so forth are important. But we can see that now we've got a list of transactions. We also see that, yes, the player 187 is important because they feature further down in the when statement. So we're talking about creating a statement for a given player that's got account number 1. Now we can also see that there are a bunch of transactions that are set up, and some of those transactions are for account number 1, and therefore we can see, yes, the ones that are for account number 1 are the ones that appear in 187's statement. So there it is, it's number 1, number 4, there it is, and number 7, that appears. Okay, so if we reverse engineer some kind of intent, some kind of meaning to this rather dense example, it's probably a statement like, in a player's statement, we should only show the transactions that come from the account that belongs to that player. Something like that. That's really all this is showing. And that's a pretty ordinary business rule. You wouldn't expect too many programmers to get that wrong in terms of their understanding of business rules. So I think you kind of wasted a lot of people's brain power just trying to reinterpret this rule for a rule that they probably would have assumed is normal behavior of an account statement anyway. But okay, so at least we've managed to identify one rule. But what about all this other stuff? What about all this repeated stuff on the accounts? We can now see that that really wasn't necessary at all. All we needed was 3 different transactions from an account belonging to a player and transactions belonging to accounts that don't belong to that player. And for that, we've created 3 accounts. So there's some interface available to the author of this test example that lets you create accounts, but it says, well, tell me the account name, tell me the type, credit limit, balance, and status, because maybe all those things are mandatory fields on an account. That's a normal thing. But rather than create a simple custom account creator where you say, just give me accounts, or indeed just give me transactions. I don't care about the account details. They've instead had to use this single generic interface to do this. So all of that is yak hair, basically. You've heard the phrase shaving the yak. That's where you have to do some painfully unhelpful task in order to get to the task that you really do want to do. And so, yeah, shaving the yak is doing the thing that's in the way of you doing the thing you want to do. And this has left the hair from our shaved yak all through our example specification here. It's just creating noise and reducing readability. Now, you could say the same thing is true of this other information about the account. It's true of our currencies and amounts, the fact that these are repeated there. Whatever this GW thing is, we don't know what that is, but clearly those don't seem to matter. And indeed, we've got the same currency and amounts, and we don't know whether the status is assuming it's the status, we don't know whether that's important or not either. So if we mask all of that, then we're perhaps left with things that we think might be useful here. So maybe, given that it's a scenario called weekly statement, then probably transaction dates do matter. So we'll leave those because we think those are important. But let's have a quick look. We know that it's a weekly statement. We would expect, therefore, 1 week's worth of transactions to be in this. And it is a more likely, it is a possible mistake for an implementation team to make that, okay, do I include the date of statement? Do I include that? Is that part of that in or out on my boundary? But in this particular example, they've failed to do that. We can see that there is 7 days worth of transactions from the 1st of January to the 7th of January, and those are included in the weekly statement. But we failed to prove that we would successfully filter out anything earlier than 7 days ago or anything after the statement date. So the one business rule that might have been worth demonstrating, which is to say only include transactions for the 7 days leading up to this date, this example has completely failed to show. Okay, so we should focus on a single rule at a time, and our specification with examples should be upfront and clear about what that rule is. So don't take too many words over it, but be clear, be bold in your example and your specification as to what this is about and what is the rule or the case that we're focusing on. Other tips is that you can write, start with the outputs, start with the end in mind. So either write your then clause first, or if you're using Fitness, your output columns, and then work backwards. Try to say, what's the minimum I need to be able to get this output? And the other tip is to include at least one keyword from your assertion or your expectation in the name of your test. So you should be able to see, if this is about the transaction days, then I would expect to see the date as part of the thens, and I expect that to be mentioned in the scenario name. Okay, and then the third point is about the importance of contrast. So one more nasty example to look at here. This one's called bonus discount, and it involves a user, Mike. And Mike clicks on home, and then he enters orbital in the search box, and then the page is artists. He clicks on find tickets. The page is tickets. He clicks on buy tickets. The page is cart. He enters gorillas. The page is artists. So a lot of typey clicky, I would describe this as. This is going through the sequence of events in the UI to be able to get to something that at the end, magically, a discount of 10% is applied. So like the previous problem, we've got no description of the rules. It's got a lot of UI details, so that's, again, a bad sign. You're describing how to test, not what to test, because you're getting tied up in all of the mechanics of how you get data in and out of this. There's a lot of signs here that this was written after the fact. This wasn't it wasn't test-driven development at all. Somebody's already done the implementation, and they're just using Gherkin or using Cucumber perhaps as a test tool after the fact. We have one mysterious output, this 10%, but how do we know what led to that 10% discount? Was it something special about the search criteria? Was it about the number of things you did? Was it something special to do with Mike as the user? Who knows? The problem here all stems to the fact that it's a script that's describing how, and it doesn't have any what or certainly no why. And the root of all of this is that it's trying to explain something through a single example, and that's almost always a source of failure. You can't understand a general rule from a single point, from a single example. You need examples and counterexamples. It's the combination of those that helps you understand the rule. So what does that mean? Sort of let's turn to analogy. If you've you might recognize this image if you've done anything to do with genetics and evolutionary biology. So these are pepper moths. So this comes from a study that was done sort of many years back around proving sort of essentially the Darwin's theory of evolution. So the pepper moth is native to, well, I don't know if it's native to the UK, but it's found in the UK. Its natural habitat is these, the white lichen on, I think, birch trees that were found in the UK. And white moths on white lichen are nicely disguised. The problem was that during the Industrial Revolution in the UK, the dark satanic mills spewing out coal dust and smoke blackened all the trees. So the natural habitat of the white pepper moth suddenly became black trees, and they were standing out as very starkly visible rather than camouflaged moths against the tree. Now there was also a rare, very small percentage of the population was a black mutation of the moth. And naturally, if you're a black moth, hiding out on a white tree, you're rather visible to birds. And just to give a sense of that, there are actually two moths in each pictures. So that's the black pepper moth on a black tree, and that's a white pepper moth on the white tree. So you can get a clear sense of just how effective the disguise is, or the camouflage is, if you're on the right colored tree. The point is that we can see clearly the moth that's in contrast to its background, but we can't see anything that's the same color as its background. So if you don't have any contrast against the thing you're viewing in plain sight, you're not going to be able to see it because it just blends into the background. So that's the same problem with our single example cases. We don't, we can't infer a rule from a case that doesn't have some kind of contrast involved in it, some kind of background. So we need both examples and counterexamples, and we need to treat those as foreground and background that help us to see exactly the boundaries of our rule. Or think of it as positive cases and negative cases. A lot of testers will use that language. That's really what we're talking about here when we talk about positive and negative tests. So we can have a quick look at an example of this to good effect. So I've got lots of bad examples of in this talk, but here's one good one. So this is about free delivery. So we've got a short description of the business rule, which is essentially saying free delivery is offered to VIP customers for a certain number of books. It's not offered to regular customers or for VIP customers buying anything other than books. And the minimum number of books needed to get free delivery is 5. So we would expect the following examples to hold true. So notice here there's only one positive test or positive example. It's a VIP customer with 5 books in the cart does get free delivery. That's what this rule is about. And all of the other 4 examples, the next 4 rows, are counterexamples. They're all showing where we would not get free delivery. But they're useful because they vary only slightly from the positive case. So they help us to see, okay, we are showing examples of the boundaries of this rule, like the number of books matters. So the 4 books doesn't get you free delivery. being a regular customer and not a VIP customer, no matter if you've got 10 books, doesn't get you a free delivery. And putting something else in the cart that's not going to be so easy to deliver, like a washing machine, also gets you standard delivery, not free delivery. So each of those are useful counterexamples that sit alongside the positive example. Okay, so those are the example cases. I wanted to just bring up one point, because I spent, you can tell I'm the kind of guy that does obsess over the details of the way these tests are written, and sometimes I get this kind of reaction from, usually from development managers, but other people will make this complaint as well. I said, well, David, it's all very well for us to do all this work on these tests up front and sort of putting the documentation in, putting the rules in, and making good examples and making sure everything makes sense. But, and that might be good work, but if we do that, that's going to slow down development, especially because you're saying we should be doing that, ahead of writing the code. So we're not sure that this really justifies it, because it's going to slow us down. And I sort of end up having to acknowledge that this is true, but it's only true in a rather trivial sense. It's true in the same way that the public bus is slowed down by stopping for passengers, because the speed of the bus is not the point. And the same way, the speed at which you are writing untested code is not the point. There's a nice phrase from Kent Beck. He said, "Code that isn't tested doesn't work. This seems to be the safe assumption." And that's something I firmly believe. So if we're slowing anything down by investing time in writing our acceptance tests and doing them well up front, the thing we're actually slowing down is the amount of untested code we're writing. And maybe that is a good thing to be slowing down, when what we want is working tested features as our measure of progress. So yes, don't fall victim to the sort of bus analogy or the bus speed analogy that making this investment in testing slows down development. That makes no sense, because it's already about the journey. Okay. I've got enough time, I think, just for one little story here. When my late father was an advocate of green energy, long before this was really became the popular thing that it is now, he sort of foresaw the whole energy crises before they occurred. And I remember him explaining to me as a 7-year-old kid that all this petrol that we put in our car is going to run out one day. There's only so much of it, and when it's gone, it's gone. There's no getting any more of it. And this seemed like a pretty shocking bit of news. I said, well, how long have we got? He said, well, it'll probably happen in about 30 years. And of course, when you're 7, well, what are you worried about? That's like 4 lifetimes away. We'll be flying around in jetpacks by then. So this is hardly a problem. But anyway, time passed, as it does. And I thought, gee, Dad's deadline has passed. So, what's the state of the oil reserves? And so I spoke to my brother-in-law, who works in oil exploration. I posed the same question to him. I said, well, Rich, you ought to know what's the expectation on how long the oil will last. He said, probably about 30 years. I'm thinking, hang on, something fishy is going on here. Is this a stock answer? Is there a post-it note in OPEC saying, if anyone asks about the oil, say 30 years? I said, well, it's funny, because that's the answer my dad gave in the 1970s. So have we really found that much more oil? He said, well, no, it's not so much that. He said, the models have improved, so we have a better sense of what's out there than perhaps we had in the 70s. But essentially, the overall, global models are much the same. So I said, well, how come we think we got so much more? He said, the difference is that oil doesn't sort of sit in a big tank just below the surface, waiting for us to use it. It costs money to get oil out of the ground. And it's found in different reserves, different fields, in different locations, different places around the world. And so a great big field that's sort of not far below the deserts of Saudi Arabia is a nice, easy, cheap thing to exploit. So when you're selling oil at $5 a barrel, which is pretty much what we did for most of the years leading up to the 1970s, then anything that costs you less than $5 a barrel to get out of the ground is something you can make a profit from. But something that's deeper and harder or riskier to get out and might cost you $10 a barrel to get out of the ground, you're going to leave that there if you can only sell it at 5. This is the same as Jeff's arguments this morning. So there's lots of oil in the 1970s that we knew existed but wasn't worth extracting. Of course, those economics are only true when oil is $5 a barrel. Oil shoots up to $60, $70, even $100 a barrel. Suddenly you're looking at those fields with a different lens. Suddenly you can make money out of exploiting something that was otherwise something you would have left behind. So why do I tell that? It's because this is like, this is part of the argument that I use when saying it's worth investing time in our tests if we see them as more than just tests. If I can get paid back for my efforts for more than just testing, then it's like selling the same artifact twice. So imagine I go to someone in your organization, you've got an overloaded BA, and I say, well, the teams are complaining they don't have good specifications to develop against. What if I did that for you? If you outsource that to me, is that worth something to you? And somebody says, yeah, that sounds great. I'll give you $10 a time at that. Now, that's different to me going to the test manager and saying, you could outsource your tests to me. Oh, well, my testers are cheap. I can only pay you $5 a time for that. Okay, well, that's fine, but I'm going to add the 10 that I got from the other guy because my plan is to use one artifact for both. Then I can go off to somebody else and go to the product owner and say, you haven't got any system documentation. What if I documented every single story with good, clear, readable examples in them? Oh, fantastic. I'll give you $20 every time. So now, okay, I add that up. I'm earning, what is that? I'm earning $35 on every artifact that I create that otherwise was only valued at $5 if I just saw it as a test. So this is my point, is that the amount of investment it's worth putting in is a direct function of how we value the things we're creating. And so this is the whole logic here, is to say, I need to see that there's more value in what I'm creating than just as a test. Okay, I think my time's up, so I'm just going to finish with one little story. Again, a Pixar reference, this one from Finding Nemo, where I paraphrase the sharks who used to say, fish are friends, not food. I like to say testers are friends, not food. It's not to do with the arrogance of testers, although I have, of developers, but I have met some that would put Brucey and his fellow sharks to shame. It's not so much about that. It's about understanding what is the role of testers on a team. Because quite often I get asked the question, well, in an Agile team, how many testers should I have in my team? And I say, well, it's a difficult question because it's a bit like asking, how many friends should you have? So let's consider this. Well, what's a good measure of a friend? I think there's a sort of universal thing, isn't there? That a friend is someone that would help you move your sofa. I think that's usually considered the measure of whether someone is above or below that bar. That's a proper definition of a friend, I think. Of course, there's your best friend, who is someone who'd help you move a dead body, but that's a special case. But for everything else, we've got Facebook friends. The reason I do this is to say, well, what are you? Let's imagine that you're a developer on a team, and a new team member has just joined. She's another developer. She's coded up her first feature. She's about to put it live, and she says to you, "Oh, hi! Look, I've just coded up my first feature. I could really do with a tester just to help me make sure I've got this right." And you might think, "Oh, sorry, didn't HR explain? I'm a developer, not a tester." And you might sort of wheel your chair around and get on with what you're doing. But what if she'd posed the same question to you, but only changed one word? What if she said, "Oh, hi, look, I've just coded up my first feature. I want to put it live. I could really do with a friend just to make sure I've got this right." What are you going to do? Are you going to say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I'm a developer, not a friend"? It doesn't really make any sense to look at it that way. So think of the thing that we do as tester, or indeed as any other role in our team. We should be judged not by our role descriptions, but by our actions. I'll leave you with that thought. Thanks very much.
Thank you, David, very much. Unfortunately, we don't have time for questions, but maybe on your next talk, I encourage you guys to ask questions via Match About app, and then they can be answered. Yes.
So I am on the dev stage in 15 minutes' time with a completely different talk, but if you want to ask questions with me, you're allowed to do so then.